This is Kim Meyer, host of Choose to Rise. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining the Confessions of a Military Spouse podcast. I am your host, Jenna Burt. I'm a military spouse of 10 years, a health and fitness enthusiast, a mom, and a registered and certified dental assistant. Again, thank you for being here with me today, and if you find that today's episode resonates with you or you know someone else that could benefit from hearing this, please share it. Also, as you guys know, I love and appreciate any and all feedback, good or bad. So if you would like to leave some feedback, please feel free to email me at confessionsofamilspouse@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook at Confessions of a Military Spouse, or you can find me on Instagram at Confessions of a Mil Spouse. So I am really excited for today's episode because we have a very special guest with us. And without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to Sarah. And she is with Secure Families Initiative. And let's just go ahead and jump right in. First of all, welcome and thank you for being here with me today, Sarah.
Thank you, Jenna. I've been listening to your podcast on my metro ride, so it's a thrill to be on the other side of the microphone. This is great.
Oh, that's super exciting. I love that. I absolutely love that. So, first of all, I want to congratulate Sarah on launching her website. It actually launched a little bit early, correct?
Yes, we made a game time decision to launch a week early from what our plans were, but yep, it's all out there.
Well, that's super exciting. So congratulations on that. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, which I tend to do a lot, why don't you go ahead and tell all of our listeners who you are and why you decided to start this project?
Totally. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Streyder. I am a relative, I would say, baby on the military spouse spectrum. I have been married for 5 years to my active duty Air Force sergeant, and we've spent 4 years in the military. So we have lots to learn about our journey moving forward, but it's been exciting so far. And I can tell you, what I really appreciate about your podcast, Jenna, is you talk about all of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And truly being a military spouse includes all of those pieces. We have had hard times. We've spent about 2/3 of our marriage living long distance because of our desire to both have work lives, which is very hard to juggle. But we've also met some of the best people we could have ever met, friends that have become chosen family. And so, I think that's probably something that most of us can relate to.
Yes, I agree completely. And I love that you threw out there the good, bad, and the ugly, because that's really why I started this podcast, because there is so much of that and so much that military spouses feel alone in. So I started that so military spouses could feel the way that you feel. But I want to say that I think it is amazing, and she's going to talk about it in just a minute, I promise. But I think it's amazing that you have started this project after only being a spouse for 4 years. I have been a military spouse for 10 years and finally got the nerve to do a podcast about it. So after only 4 years of being a spouse, I think it is so amazing that you have started this project. So I'm sure everybody is wondering, what the heck is this project?
Yeah, what are we even talking about?
So I guess that's what happens when you get a little bit of behind the scenes information. So go ahead and tell people, because I'm so excited for it.
Yeah, totally. So our project's called the Secure Families Initiative, like Jenna mentioned, and we are essentially a resource hub for anyone who wants to get more involved in voting and advocating, specifically on issues of foreign policy, which I'm sure I'll dig deeper into later. But essentially, the idea for this project came when I first PCS'd out here to Northern Virginia earlier last summer. And I was unemployed, I was looking for work, and I went to this event about military spouse unemployment. And I noticed that the way that we talked about a lot of the challenges facing military families, whether it's unemployment, whether it's other economic difficulties, whether it's mental health diagnosis, you name it, we talk about it as if they are isolated things that are disconnected from the foreign policy decisions that our country makes that ultimately shape our operational tempo and then by default shape our lifestyles as military families. And it's a shame that we talk about it that way because it loses sight of that direct kind of connection. And I thought, it would be great if there could be a home for military spouses who want to get more involved in telling their stories, in explaining to voters as well as leaders in our country what it's like to live as a military spouse or family member when you know that at any moment your loved one could be called to deploy or just show up to work and put in lots of time to make sure our country is safe. The experience of being that loved one is a story that I feel is really missing. Hollywood does a great job at telling the story of someone who goes and serves on the front lines, right? The gritty
Yes.
wartime movies we see a lot of these days, but there's no movie out there that talks about being a single parent for 6 months at a time, or melting down in the grocery store because you miss your loved one so much and it just kind of sneaks up on you in that kind of way. Or the PCSs that I know you've talked a lot about on your podcast and Murphy's Law and all that. Those are stories I don't think people understand. They don't see a lot of. And I think we could use a bit more representation. So
yes, absolutely.
Thanks. Yeah, and so we started this project to to help be a hub for folks who want to tell their stories, for folks who want to take the first step and get more involved in voting, but don't know where they're supposed to register or how that works when you're military, because it's uniquely tricky. We just want to be able to give information and kind of hold folks' hands and say, we'll take you one step along that path wherever you are and help you get more involved. So that's us. That's SFI.
And I think that's super important. And one of the things that actually drew me to you and to this, project when you reached out to me was the fact that you are, concerned with the military spouse stories. And again, that's part of the reason that I started this podcast was because I feel like we do have a story and it's not heard very often. And what is heard is almost glamorized when that's really not how it is.
Yeah.
And so to have, another force taking it even further, for me, I think it's amazing. And I will say that I don't know, what the percentage is that of military spouses that either don't know how to vote whenever, they are a military spouse or are afraid to vote being a military spouse or even voice their opinions on politics being a military spouse. Like I am one of those people. I don't really talk about politics. I haven't voted in I don't know how many years because I don't really particularly know how, because I have this home of record and that's not actually where I live and what do I do?
Right.
So this whole project to me is very interesting and I think it's very, very important.
Well, thank you. Your experience is really common. There isn't a really easy answer to where you're supposed to vote and how to do it. I mean, there are resources out there. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't always feel like the resources are being connected with the folks that need it most and want it most. And so we're trying to help bridge the gap that we've seen. Really, I think another value that our program has is we're very clear that we're a nonpartisan program. We certainly have values that we think are important when it comes to foreign policy, like making sure that our diplomatic corps is well resourced, just as our military is, to make sure that our engagement with the world is principled and peace being an important first step. But that is something that we can find a lot of common ground on, no matter who you are or what your personal politics are or what your background is, or if you've even, decided to pay attention to politics before. Really, what we're trying to focus on is the things that we can agree on and unite around. And so hopefully, if you check out our website, maybe we can help answer some of your questions about where to vote. And when your home of record is somewhere different from where you live, it can feel like you're disconnected from the election you vote in, and sometimes that means it's not as fun to vote in, or you don't feel like you have the information to make an informed decision about how to vote. And we want to help with that as well.
Yes. And for me, I think that's my biggest thing when it comes to politics. Because I mean, I'm not a very political person. I'll be the first to say it. I don't really get involved. And the reason that I don't get involved is because I don't have the information that I feel I need in order to make an educated decision, in order to, talk about it on a level of importance. And obviously I know things need to change, and peace is obviously what everybody wants. But I don't feel like I know enough or I'm connected enough in order to talk about that stuff. So to have somebody who is representing that and who maybe has more of those answers than I obviously do, I think is a great resource for military spouses, because we talk all the time, about politics. And, obviously there's a lot happening in our world right now that a lot of people are very vocal about. So to have someone who has that information and that knowledge, I think is amazing.
Totally. And I will say too, don't cut yourself short, because I think we tend to think that in order to be vocal or say anything or make any sort of opinion, that we have to be some sort of expert, right? That we have to have all of the information at our disposal, the data, have watched TV and watched all the talking heads to get all the different perspectives or whatever. But politics at its foundation are personal. It's about you, your experience, what you care about, what you see in the world around you, because you have a perspective that no one else has. And it's only when we combine all of those different perspectives that we get the best decisions. And so I would say you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be a full-time policy wonk to deserve to have your voice heard or to deserve to vote, right? You are a constituency, and what matters to you should matter to your elected officials. So I would say cut yourself a little bit of slack, and I feel more. I would hope that every single military spouse feels completely empowered to tell their story, whatever that looks like. The dramatic, the mundane, it really, all of it matters, and all of it has certain implications. And we just want to help give you a few more extra tools to be the best spokesperson for yourself and your family that you could be.
Yeah. And I love that you said, you don't have to be an expert on it, because I do feel like, especially as a military spouse, because we're kind of in the heat of it, I know if I'm feeling this way, there's got to be other military spouses that are feeling this way too. Like, well,
totally.
I can't really voice my opinion because I'm not an expert on it, so my opinion is not going to matter. So I like that you said that, you don't have to be an expert to voice your opinion. And that's kind of what happened when I started this podcast. Look, I am no expert in military spouse matters by any means, but I know that I have been dealt a shitty hand sometimes, and that other people have too. And I just wanted people to know, right? I wanted people to know that they were not alone. And so I think in this matter too, it's very important that they understand, myself included, that I don't have to be an expert, and that the experiences that I have had are worth being heard, and they need to be heard.
Yes, no, absolutely. They do. I mean, so here's a great example. In the fall, there are the NDAA that was passed, which is basically the bill that funds military and other defense stuff. It included certain, what I would say, successes in the bill, things like repealing the widow's tax on survivors' benefits. They passed a housing bill of rights for military residents in base housing. Those are great examples of things that affect our community very personally. And what it took was years and years of military spouses and family members speaking up and telling their stories and reminding Congress why these things are so important. And they finally got to see kind of the fruits of their labor years past. Do you think every single person who showed up on Capitol Hill and talked to their member of Congress was, a full-fledged lobbyists with years of governmental relations experience. Not at all. No, they're just
Probably
saying,
not.
hey, I live in base housing. It sucks. Could you help me make it less sucky? Right? That's all it takes. And that's really powerful.
And it's so true. And I know military housing is under attack once again, as with the whole mold issue. And everybody that's come forward, like you said, everybody that's come forward, it's going to take years, obviously, for this to get resolved. But all of these little steps and all of these little stories being told are what add up to that big thing to make our Congress see, and to make the people who need to see these things so they can make those changes. But imagine if we all kept our mouths shut and nobody said anything about the mold issues that were going on and the sickness that's been caused from that. Nothing would ever get done. So I think it's a great reminder. Like you said, you don't have to be an expert. I don't have to be an expert. Just my podcast in general and talking about how terrible TRICARE is. I had a really bad experience last night, so that's fresh on my mind. But how terrible TRICARE is going to be the thing that drives them to change.
Yeah. And, you mentioned a little bit earlier about the moment that we're in right now, above all other moments with lots of things happening on the global stage, lots of tensions, lots of aggressions that seem to be piling up. That makes it really scary, honestly, to be the loved one of someone who serves in uniform. I think a lot of us are coping with that fear, and we all have a different way of coping, right? For some of us, it's hunkering down, it's self-care, it's spending quality time just within our cocoon. But for some of us, we're passionate, we're angry, and we feel like our voices aren't being represented, our values aren't being represented, and we want that to change. And so for some of us, coping looks more active, it looks more outward, right? I would say this moment in particular, foreign policy is an industry that's dominated by lots of men in suits. And I think this political moment calls for more women in jeans, because we're scrappy. We know what it is to make a lot out of a little. We are the point people in our families to integrating within whatever community that we integrate within every time we PCS. And we've got the passion that I think will relate to a lot of people that are trying to make sense of all of these big global factors, right? We can reduce it to something very simple, very understandable, and very relatable. And so that's why, to your point about this moment being the best moment of all other moments to get involved, especially on something like decisions over war and peace, I think you're absolutely right. And that's why we launched a week early, frankly. And that's why we're existing now, today, this year, because it's relevant, and I think we're needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I think it's more relevant now than it's ever been. And I think we as military spouses are more needed now than we've ever been, because like you said, it's run by these men in suits, and they're not the ones that are shipping their spouses and their loved ones off to a foreign country where we don't know if we're going to hear from them for days, months, weeks at a time. Yeah. They're not the ones that are holding down the fort and going to all the doctor's appointments and making dinner every single night and making sure that the kids are at their 17 different activities while their spouse is gone, plus worrying about that on top of it. I mean, they're not the ones doing this. And so I've always, said to myself and to my husband, it's hard for people to see things when they're not actually in it, if that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah.
And that was part 2 of my reason of starting this podcast, and why I'm so happy to have you here as well advocating, because I feel like a lot of, I say civilians, but people that aren't, full on hands involved in the military, I think it's glamorized to them, and they think, oh, well, you have free healthcare, and, you have a guaranteed income, and, you get to move every 3 years. I feel like to them, they see this glamorous life, but they're not in the heat of it, and they're not in the thick of it, and they're not, here whenever, your 7-year-old daughter has to tell her dad goodbye, and she doesn't quite understand why, so to bring that awareness to everybody, I think is super important.
Can we talk about homecoming videos for a second? Because
Yes.
homecoming videos are one of the best examples of what this disconnect that you're talking about, right?
Yes.
You talk about the romance, you talk about the glamour, and don't get me wrong, people who film homecoming videos and are part of them, like clearly they look beautiful. They really do. And they pull at the heartstrings and they make you feel all the feels. But they're two-dimensional to an extent, right? They don't fully represent the depth and the layers of emotions of what it takes for that homecoming to happen. I remember
Absolutely.
when I was about a
Absolutely.
week or two away from Jason getting back from deployment, and I had a lot of people come up to me and they're like, "Oh my gosh, you must be so excited that your husband's almost home, right?" And the way that they asked the question, they put on this emotional expectation. And what I wanted to tell them was like, well, yes, I do love this person, and therefore to be able to hug them again is a net positive. But what I'm also feeling is a lot of anxiety. Like, what's it going to be to be together again now that we've been apart for so long? How has he changed? How have I changed in ways we may not be able to consciously realize? And yeah, what's it going to look like? I was anxious. I was stressed, but I didn't feel like I could express that because people would just look at me funny. Like, what, are you not grateful? or a lot of other bull crap, I would say. And
Absolutely.
So, yeah, homecoming videos are just this, like the pinnacle of, I think, where it's incomplete with what it shows.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I went through all of those emotions too whenever my husband recently came back from his deployment. And, while yes, I was excited, like you said, I think I was more anxious and nervous and scared and all of these other feelings for him to come home, because we had been living two separate lives and we were two totally different people than we were 9 months ago whenever he left.
Right. Yeah, and it was like you were incubating in two different petri dishes.
Yes. And now we have to come together and figure out, how the heck do we live together? And then on top of it, we had a PCS.
Oh, yeah. And you've got kids too, which I can only imagine makes it like 10 times harder to mesh back into yourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I was the one running her to all of these different activities that she was involved in. And he comes home and he's just kind of sitting there like, well, where do I fit in? What do I do? And, you as a military spouse almost have to take a step back and say, oh, shit, I've got another person here. What am I going to do with them?
And see, this is exactly the gritty behind the scenes layer of storytelling that I would see as being tremendously valuable. I mean, just in and of itself, for like my own sake, I like to joke that this project is a project of selfishness, because really it's just an excuse to meet cool people and talk about my life. But beyond that, if we think to more noble ends, it's just. I mean, I would appreciate seeing myself more reflected, my lived experience more reflected with the materials out there, whether the videos or the blog posts or the op-eds, just to feel like my voice is better represented. And then think of the impact that could have, right? What if people really understood not just the black and white statistics of what it takes to be at war, but the full color, technicolor, texturized experience of what it actually takes, right? To fully understand the experience, the burden that is held by the families that are most involved, that carry kind of the responsibility to carry out the mission. I think if that understanding were had at a higher, more intensified levels, I don't know. I feel like decisions would look different and considerations would look different. The talking heads on TV would sound different when they talk about troop deployments and abroad conflicts, and the value of having strong diplomatic representation in order to shield our military service members from having to always be the ones engaging. I can't help but think the world would be a better place. And so, for that end, for the future military spouses who are going to inherit this lifestyle after you and I have both moved on, hopefully, knock on wood.
Oh, yeah. And that's the thing, like already thinking about future military spouses, the first thing that came to my mouth was those poor spouses.
Oh my gosh.
It didn't have to be like that. It shouldn't have to be like that. I mean, you know, this military life can be an amazing thing, but it's become so tainted because of decisions that have been made from people that are not involved in it daily and people that don't see the behind the scenes things. And, you know, every time people talk about, you know, troops deploying and people deploying and spouses and loved ones and all of this, it's always about them deploying, which I understand that. But where does it come in of what about the spouses and families left behind? Where does that come in?
Right, right. And even if the loved one doesn't deploy, I mean, that's certainly the most kind of intense experience that we as families deal with. But even simply, even if they're still stateside, let's say, but their work hours are what they are. And part of that's intrinsic. I know it's not going to change. It's kind of built into military lifestyle. But I also think it'd be wrong to assume that being at war didn't exacerbate that, didn't make it just simply the work tempo that much harder for loved ones.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about it. When they are getting ready for a deployment, they're doing pre-deployment training. They're doing, you know, they're in the field. They're doing all of these things to get ready for this, which means they're gone even more. You know, their hours are even longer. There's so much more that happens prior to this because of this.
Absolutely, exactly. They're home, but they're not present necessarily.
Yep. Absolutely. You said it the best. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, because I feel like, you know, a lot of military spouses that aren't vocal, or even some of them that are vocal, you know, it's really easy to get wrapped up in politics and talking about it and sharing, you know, your opinion on it. And obviously people have differing opinions of politics, but I feel like a lot of times, again, myself included, spouses are a little shy or hesitant to talk about their stance on politics because they're worried about, you know, what people are going to think of them, maybe jeopardizing their spouse's career, things like that. So what, you know, from your standpoint, what is your thought process on that?
That is definitely the number one hesitancy that we encounter when we talk to military spouses. And it's one that I can completely understand and to an extent relate to. I mean, if I were to think that anything that I did or published ever would come back to bite my husband in the butt, you know, I would still probably do it, let's be real. But I would at least it would at least give me
Right.
pause, and it would make me like bummed out for 2 seconds while I thought about it. But I mean, and to an extent, look, I'm not going to say it's completely unjustified. We know that, you know, historically, once upon a time, officers' wives were, and they usually were just that, wives, were rated on their service members' performance reviews. So, you know, I get that that's still to an extent historically baked into the legacy and nature of being a military spouse. But here's what I'll say. First of all, I do believe the risk is way bigger in people's minds than it really is. A lot of people think that there are rules about what you as a military spouse can or can't say or can or can't do, and there really aren't. A lot of the rules that dictate political activity for the service member don't extend to their loved one, because we are individuals, we are separate entities from our spouse, much as the word dependent makes it feel less so, but it is true. And the only real rules we have to abide by have to do with, you know, if we share a car with our spouse or a residence with our spouse, if we're on base, things like that, whenever our lives kind of overlap. And so I think people have a lot more freedom than they think they do. And part of what we're hoping to help out with in SFI is laying out what rules do exist so that you can make an informed choice about whether to speak out or get involved that's based in information and not in fear that may or may not be warranted. And the other thing I'll say, advocacy sounds like a really intimidating word, but at its core, advocacy is storytelling. It is anecdotal, fact-based relaying of information, right? And I would argue that telling our stories is actually one of the most patriotic things that we as spouses and family members can do to support our loved ones. So I joke that the military loves its briefings, right? I don't know if you've ever tried to
Yes, they do.
If you've ever tried to do anything out of the ordinary, or even considering switching insurance plans, there's always a briefing that you either have to or are strongly encouraged to attend. And that makes sense, right? Briefings are simply information sharing so that you can make an informed and educated choice. Well, why wouldn't we want our leaders and voters to be briefed about the consequences of foreign policy decisions, right? That's at the core of it. That's what we're doing. We're telling stories and we're briefing them on what all is involved. And when you think of it that way, when you strip away a lot of the kind of assumptions about being, quote, political or being an advocate, and you get to the baseline of what it really is, I don't see how anyone could have a problem with that if they're acting in good faith and good conscience. And so that's what we're trying to encourage folks to remember, that your constituency, you deserve to have your voice heard. But more importantly, it does not have to be counter to your service members' service. If anything, it's complementary. It's adding information so that our decision makers can make the best decisions possible.
And I think it's really important that you took that and you stripped it all down, because like you said, when people hear advocacy and, they hear, that you're advocating and you want to advocate or whatever the situation is, it is, and it does, for whatever reason, kind of become this big scary word. And people automatically, I think, tend to think defensively and like, well, that's just going to cause an uproar, and, that's, not going to be good, and people aren't going to want to hear that. And, that's going to jeopardize your spouse's career because you're just being I won't say weird, but you know what I was going to say. And so I think when people hear that, it scares them away. But like you said, when you strip it all down, just like you did, it gets down to the core values, and it can only help our service members and add to their, whatever's already on their plate, and almost back them up, because I feel like our service members are thinking things that we're thinking too. I know I've had a conversation with my husband, and he's told me, like, listen, I wish that they would take our families more into consideration. He's like, but I'm just a little peon. Like, what is my voice going to do? So I feel like they're thinking that too. And when you strip all of that away, it really brings it down to its core, and it makes it a whole lot less scary. And, it's really just you telling your story and your voice being heard, but in a productive way.
Exactly. It doesn't, we think of politics as being destructive because, frankly, a lot of politicians behave that way, but it can and should be constructive, right? It should be additive and empowering and lifting up. And I love what you said about thinking about your freedoms as an individual in comparison with, say, your service member who might have more restrictions about what he or she can say. I think that is similar to kind of a paradigm shift that I had last year when I kept thinking for a long time about my military spousehood as being some sort of liability to my ability to be an advocate or a spokesperson, when really it's an asset. There's a lot of freedom in being the spouse, not the service member, in terms of rules and regulations. But there's a power to it. There's a strength to the identity that we hold. And I think, instead of hiding behind it, I think we should lean into that power, lean into that strength, and leverage it for all it's worth. Think of it as being a privilege that sure comes with a lot of downsides and sacrifices. But hey, let's cash in on that, right?
Yes,
like lean into that privilege.
Right.
And if using that privilege of being someone that people are likely to listen to, and doing that in a way that makes it easier for, like I said, people who come after us as well, as well as our kids, our families, I think that's the most responsible thing to do.
Absolutely. And, I actually had someone leave a review about my podcast, and, she said that it seemed very negatively focused. And obviously that was not the whole idea behind my podcast. The whole idea behind my podcast was to bring awareness to that negative. But like you said, we can use that to our advantage almost. And if we lean into that, yeah, it sucks, But listen, we can use that suck and we can take that and make something great of it. Like, listen, I understand it sucks that my spouse is gone. And here's why. Let me explain to you why it sucks so bad that they are gone and how can we help change that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Making lemonade out of lemons, so they say.
Yes, that is what they say. Just add a little vodka too.
Oh my goodness. And can I say too, I can relate to I remember one of the first people I showed my website to, they made a similar kind of comment. They thought, well, you're getting really, it feels like you're talking really, really negatively about your experience. And I just had to, and unsurprisingly, this person was not themselves a military spouse. So I think they felt weird about, the fact that all the kind of the valor and the honor and the kind of hoity-toity tone that we're used to when people talk about the military wasn't there. And I was like, look, people are, at least in our community, we're ready for honesty. We're ready for raw observations and feelings, all of the feelings, from positive to negative, right? I think a lot of us are craving that because that's the only way that you find actual connection to each other, when you kind of strip away all the other stuff. So that's the vibe I've gotten from your podcast. That's the vibe that we are trying to relay with all of our materials, that we're being honest. And sometimes it's not super flattering.
Yep.
Sometimes it is. But you have to embrace all of it.
You're right. Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's not always flattering. And then sometimes it is. The homecoming videos, like you said, a prime example. That is a flattering moment. What's not flattering is the 9 months that it took to
right,
get
and
to
the
that
2 boxes of
point.
Kleenex that are crumpled in the backseat of my car. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. But like you said, we can take all of this information and we can do something amazing and something great with it, which is what you, I know, are trying to focus on. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you, because I know it's kind of top of your list, is focusing on the foreign policy. And I wanted to ask you why that's so important and why should we focus on that so much, so other people can hear it too.
Totally. I think foreign policy is a really important place for us to focus our energies for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, kind of at its core, it's an area that's really nonpartisan. I mean, comparatively, compared to a lot of domestic issues you could think about where people have their opinions, they have their labels, and everyone hunkers down on their sides. Foreign policy is actually an area where there's a lot more cross-cutting agreement on certain values and certain approaches. And so I think there's power in focusing on an area where so much common ground can be found. But another reason it's important is that it's an area that feels so out of reach for most of us. Our day-to-day lives, most of us who are normal, not policy wonks, are not thinking constantly about North Korea and Iran and, relations with the EU and Brexit, unless, of course, Megxit. Of course, we think about that. But it's not something that a lot of real people get super involved in. And I think that's a shame. I think it's a bummer that foreign policy is so, I'll use the word again, hoity-toity, where the perspectives of everyday people is important. And so that's another reason that I thought it was important to focus. But of course, the main underlying reason is that it is something that directly affects us as spouses and families. Our lives are indirectly shaped by the ops tempo that our military takes on. And the military's ops tempo comes from our foreign policy. It comes from how we decide to approach the world, whether we decide to approach problems as if we're a hammer and every problem's a nail, whether this is the only tool that we have in our foreign policy toolbox is our military. It puts a lot of the burden and responsibility where maybe some of that could be shared with our diplomats, with our State Department, with our ambassadors and our embassies abroad. I think that there's a rebalancing that could be really valuable for us as families. I really do believe that we would feel on our personal lives the impacts of a shift in foreign policy to be a little less aggression focused, a little more diplomacy first. So that's, I think, the top reason why foreign policy is such an important area for us as spouses in particular to weigh in on.
And I mean, that all completely makes sense, because when it comes down to it, I mean, as a military spouse, who wouldn't want their spouse home more, and who wouldn't want more peace in the world? And, to know that our voice is being heard and people are finally beginning to understand us. And I mean, Sarah, you and we're only two voices, but if us two are feeling this way and we have these opinions and we have these stories that we can share that is going to affect these things, think of the thousands of other spouses that have these stories as well, that just need to know that they are going to be
absolutely
heard.
And that they're not alone. That was another kind of important piece of this project, is that it's easy when you're military and you move around so much and you become very isolated, right? Within your family unit, within your couple, your family, it becomes very easy to feel like you're the only ones out there. You're the only ones living this lived experience, and maybe you're the only one who has these opinions or this perspective on things. But you're not. You're one of thousands. Just like you said, us as a military, we are not a monolith. We are as diverse as the communities that we come from. And sharing our stories, not only because of the policy impact and the shaping of hearts and minds, but simply for establishing a sense of community amongst ourselves. I think that's valuable too, which segues quite nicely, if I can, into ways that folks can get involved. If after all of my blabbering, this sounds mildly interesting to any of your listeners.
No, that's actually exactly what I was going to ask next. But actually, before we jump into that, I want to point out, Sarah did an op-ed that was published on military.com, and I read that, and to be honest, my jaw just dropped to the floor. You guys, Sarah is not just some person that decided to start researching and start this project. She has so much experience and background and knowledge of what she's talking about. I will admit that I was a little nervous to do this interview because this is A, not my strong suit, but B, because of all of the experiences she has had in her life. My mind was blown. And if you don't mind, Sarah, I'd actually like you to talk about that, because you mentioned in the beginning that you and your husband had a long distance relationship for quite a while. And she talks about that in her op-ed, which I will link in the description of the podcast. But you talked about having a long distance relationship because of your careers. And I want you, if you don't mind, to talk about that a little bit, why you had that long distance relationship and what you were doing during that time.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. That's very flattering of you. We got married. So I proposed to Jason to get married the summer before my senior year of college, and we got married halfway through that year. So we were together for about 9 months while I finished my last semester, and we had our first summer together. But then the fall after I graduated, I got the opportunity to be a White House intern. So I said, "Hey, honey, I love you, but this is, kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity I'd really like to do. I'm going to move across the country." And he was like, "Cool, power with you." And so for the next year and a half, I was living in DC. I started as an intern, and then I got hired full time to work for the administration at the time. And that was the point at which my husband went to basic boot camp. He went to tech school, and then we found out that we were getting stationed in Nebraska, which is not where the U.S. federal government is located.
No, it's not.
Sadly and happily, I guess. So after many tears and much, commiseration, we just decided that it was really important for me to finish out my job while I had it. And take advantage of this opportunity to do something really important and something that I knew would help me professionally moving forward, and that he was going to obviously move to Nebraska and we were going to start out being apart. So we did that, like I said, total year and a half. And then I joined him in Nebraska. I got involved in some state stuff and found lots of good friends and great community. And then about 9 months later, I moved again because I got accepted. I know. It's so funny. A lot of our distance has been quote, my fault, which is a bit reverse.
Which is
Yeah.
unusual. Really unusual.
Our problems are completely self-inflicted at certain points. But I got accepted to a master's program at Cambridge in the UK, and if you get accepted there, you don't say no. So
right? Oh
yeah,
my
so
gosh.
I was in the UK for a year getting my master's and having a blast, but also missing my loved one deeply. And get this, because, poetic justice and all, I get back. We've been apart for a year. I'm so excited to be back in Nebraska with him. I've got, I'm fired up with all my knowledge. The exact day that I touched down in Nebraska, Jason, he's like, hey, welcome back. And then he's like, hey, FYI, just found out I'm deploying in a couple months. And I'm like, you've got to
oh my
be
God,
kidding
I'm waiting
me.
for it.
I just was gone for a year. You couldn't have deployed at any point in that entire year.
Right. That whole year, you had a whole year.
Right. Because this is, completely within your control and totally your choice. So,
of course, it always is. Duh.
So 3 months later, he leaves. This time it was his turn, and we were apart for another 6 months. Finally, he got back last May, and we PCS, and we've gotten to live within the same zip code as each other ever since, which is fabulous. But yeah, talk about unique trials and tribulations.
Seriously. And that's one of the things that I think is so awesome and that I love about you and your story and your background and what has, drove you to start this project and to help other military spouses and myself. I know I'll be reaching out on a personal level. But I thought it was important for our listeners to hear all of your background and all of your knowledge and know, like, hey, you're not just some random person that decided, I think I'll just dabble in this and try this. And, you have that knowledge and you have been in places that have, given you eye-opening experiences. And that's one of the things that I think sets you apart from, other people that maybe are trying to do the same thing, is that you have a little bit of the background of it. And it's definitely going to be beneficial for everyone who decides to come to you.
Thank you. And I have been so lucky with a lot of the things I've gotten to do and things I've gotten to learn. I mean, some of the best lessons I've learned in voting and advocacy happened when I was in Nebraska, when I was getting involved on kind of the local level, whether it was getting folks to get out and vote at the city level, or whether it was working at the state level, talking about, the values of education in schools and making sure they have the resources they need. That's where I learned a lot about organizing. And so if folks are interested, I want to put that experience to good use. I want to pass it on, right? I want you to learn from my mistakes and be able to start at a level that I wasn't at when I got started. If I can go from zero to hero, so can you. And so I especially like to plug, we've got some great material on our website that's there at any point if you ever want to access it. But one of the cool things that we're offering are webinar trainings. So, the experience that those of us on the SFI team, shout out to my teammate, Kate, who's been great at helping me prop this up from nothing. She and I both have experiences about how to be an effective advocate, and we put it into terms that make sense for a military spouse, because I think a lot of the resources out there are great, but don't always connect. And so if you ever want to join a webinar, we've picked a list of topics that are things that we've learned about. So whether that's what the do's and don'ts are for being political when you're a military spouse, whether it's how to tell your story, whether it's how to answer tough questions that you will definitely get asked, or more tangibly, how do you write a letter to the editor? What even is that? And how do you make it good? How do you canvas? All of these things are little pieces of the big puzzle, which is getting involved, making your voice heard. And by sharing our personal tidbits and a little bit of professional advice that we've gathered along the way, we want other people to have those tools too. So that's one of the coolest parts, the parts that I'm most excited with our program, that I would just plug if people are interested. Plus, when you're in a webinar, I know it's tricky times and dates and all that, but it also gives you the chance to be live in the same moment, connected with other mil spouses, and can build a community with people who are similarly interested and want to get involved. So definitely check that out on our website.
Absolutely. And I will link the website as well in the description of the podcast. So let's say we have spouses that are, listening to this and they're super excited. This is something that they want to be a part of. What are their next steps other than obviously contacting you because you're amazing, but what are their next steps?
Visit us at securefamiliesinitiative.org. There are lots of opportunities on the site to sign up, to get on our communications list, to sign up for webinars. Even if you're already rearing to go and ready to take action, we've even got some direct action opportunities on the site. And most importantly, most fundamentally, we talk about voting. So if you don't know where to register, or you've registered but you're not sure if your registration is still valid, any questions you have related to voting, our website can either answer it, or you can sign up for a webinar to talk about the registration process, where we can coach you through your own kind of personal situation. So that is step numero uno. But beyond that, we also exist on every social media platform. So Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you can find us. Our handles are all like secure_families. It is easy to find. And yeah, follow us. That's where we'll be sharing a lot of our kind of our materials, a lot of our content. And I think it also helps kind of connect with other spouses following us as well. So you can say, oh my gosh, that's a person that happens to be in my town. I didn't know she was into voting and stuff. Rad. I want to be her friend. Great excuse to do that too. So find us on social media in addition to our website.
Awesome. I think that is amazing. And like you said, you never know the connections you're going to make. I have made connections with people in some of the weirdest places. My best friend, actually, she was actually active duty, and so were her husband. But the way that I met her was we both used a specific kind of cloth diapers, and we both cloth diapered our kids, and we met.
Oh my gosh, small world
on Facebook. A cloth diapering, right? A cloth diapering group through Facebook. So, and I run a lot of obstacle course races, and one of my good race friends I met through Instagram, through a hashtag. So social media is amazing. And I'm so glad that you guys are on all platforms of social media, because like you said, people may be checking you out and they may be like, oh my gosh, I know that girl. Like, she lives in my neighborhood. I didn't realize like she wanted to be this involved like me. I'm going to hit her up.
And I remember the day that I met my first like Politico milspouse gal friend. It was in Nebraska. She was working for a campaign and I was kind of working for this other thing. And I tell you, the moment we met was just this revelation, like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one. I can both be connected to the military and be interested in politics. Who'd have thunk? And to have her as that friend that we could bounce off ideas and commiserate about the things that we did, it was a game changer. So I would definitely, shout out to my friend Heather, would definitely advocate, go find yourselves your own Heathers. And if we can help you find your Heathers, all the better.
Absolutely. Well, before we wrap it up, is there anything else that you want to tell all of our listeners?
Don't be afraid of your power and your voice. Now is the time to speak up and make your voice heard. Don't be shy is the big takeaway of all of this, really. You have a lot of power and a lot of value in your perspective. Don't undermine it, and don't hide it under a bushel, as a Bible school song would tell me from way back in childhood. This is your moment. And if we can help you feel more equipped to do it and inspire the courage to do it, all the better. But you've got a lot more to offer than you might think.
Absolutely. And the only other thing that I would add, and that I have really learned from this interview, is not to be scared. Don't let politics and all of that intimidate you. You guys are here to help. Obviously, Sarah is a very lovely person, and she's not going to be one to put you down by any means. I can tell just by talking to her on this interview. So like I said, the biggest takeaway from me is not to be scared and to use my power for the betterment of everyone,
Woohoo!
Including myself.
Mission accomplished.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for being here with me today. I'm so excited and so happy to have had you. And like I said, I will link the op-ed in the description. I will also put your website on there for anybody who wants to find you. And again,
That'd
thank
be
you
awesome.
for being
Thanks,
here.
Jenna. Bye, guys.